Okay. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Manon, thank you to the AOR, thank you to the AA. Funny, it's a sort of a funny thing to discuss in a way. I got Dennis's pictures. Dennis sent me his pictures, and I was really taken by them. And I agree that nothing properly had been said about the palace, with all its kind of questions, of which I think Lily's question at the end is sort of fundamental, but not for me to answer. So what I'm going to do, very quickly, in the interest of conversation, I think it is really important that there's a conversation, and I think it is great that the AOR expands its information through events like this. So in that interest, I'm going to go quite quickly through, I realize, 10 pieces of work that are about, or at the time felt that they were about some kind of idea of the island. It strikes me that in say medieval studies, they talk about insular art. Same thing. And I think it's kind of interesting to look at it that way, that it's an archipelago, let's say, of ideas. So I'm going to go quickly. They're just postcards, if you like, and if I ramble on too much, it's because I've gotten interested in them again. Some of them are quite old. I thought there should be a comma between imagined and Ireland. So this is a road that was made illegally in Achill on the west coast of Ireland by a developer in a fit of pique. And he made the road over on a Friday night, and he delivered this over the weekend, which is very beautiful and very rough. And so when it went through the shenanigans of planning on common land, it was found to be illegal and ordered to be demolished. So we went to film it, myself and Peter Maybury, because we thought it was really fantastic. And actually, when you were there, it was even more. And the sound of it, and its destruction, and its its precision, considering the timeline it was made in. It was made out of somebody's pocket, albeit going bankrupt. And we called it These Islands. This film was a 7-minute film that then became an essay in San Rocco that I wrote about, where I took the planning report and wrote it as an inspector calls. And actually, the failure of the planning application and the appeal was actually the argument for the sublime. But you can see that in San Rocco. So then this is N3. This is actually the cover of the Department of Foreign Affairs brochure for it before it was built. So it's kind of fun with the harp and the thing. And that project was 2000, and it was to make the first official representation of the country in the Venice Biennale, in the Giardini. And of course, the question of not having a pavilion and renting a pavilion and not having any money and so on kind of generated an idea about, it's kind of like a lot of this stuff is really, actually falls into the same sort of hoop, funnily enough, when I look at it, which is maybe, sometimes I think it's comfortable and sometimes I think it's uncomfortable. I think that these kind of projects are, in a way, very difficult because you end up dealing with cliches. But Joseph Boyce did some very nice work in Ireland, and there's a very great piece by him called Irish Battery, which is 2 briquettes with some Dairygold butter between it. And I thought that was really amazing, and you can buy this stuff, and it's for sale, it's ground for sale. So the project essentially became something, a material that was free, and how do you stack it in an order that has charge and makes a pavilion. And then this is the ambassador looking at it. You know, that's a little north point. It's N3, N cubed. It was dedicated. There's a kind of a Shaggy Dog story which about sins. And then inside it becomes a bunch of cards which are kind of like football cards. So rather than it being a pavilion, well, rather than being a sculpture, it's a pavilion in that it has some information to give, albeit silent, just pictures. And they're flip cards where you get front side, you know, San Nicolo de Lido, an empty confessional, Air N, housing in Ireland, the cliche by John Hind, Pfennig stamps as N, money basically. It's all about money. It's all about money and value and speculation and maps and ground. But essentially it's an exercise in corbelling and glue. And then it's given as a gift. It was a Trojan horse given as a gift because we couldn't really afford to bring it back. So the Venetian authorities accepted it as manure for the Giardini, so we make our point. 10 years later, I curated with Peter Maybury and Alice and Cian of Taka sort of a homage to deBlacam and Meagher, who are they're very much invested in I suppose an invention of an idea of Irish architecture which maybe lasts. I mean I noticed that Andrew says there's no style, but maybe deBlacam and Meagher were the great stylists out of Cannes for a version of Irish architecture. So we made 5 stacks of books that were photos, original John Donats, then new photos, a newspaper which was about the society and culture of the office and what it brought, from aircraft interiors to the chaplet knock, and then a full set of working drawings of the wooden building, which was really nice. And then it becomes a kind of a cartoon, overscaled oak paper, gold wedge, because the floor was uneven in the little oratory. And like all exhibitions, it became a kind of a caricature. And then we made a chair, did this chair, which is a version of a chair that deBlacam and Meagher did, which is a version of a chair that the OPW used in the Casino at Marino. So you're kind of riffing off this kind of idea of continuity. And people, yeah, it was very nice, people walking around with big rolls of drawings, very nostalgic, and you could take them away. And the information is presented neat. It takes close reading. It's very good. There's no hostage to those who are not interested in deBlacam and Meagher. And then it was a very difficult process. They felt there's a reason why deBlacam and Meagher don't have a book out, put it that way. So we made another book after that. About the experience, which is without deBlacam and Meagher, which is called Of, and it's about making books and having fun with it. I made this with Peter Maybury as well, and it goes through everything about typeface and spacing and turning of pages and round versus square. This then is Unbrand of. This was commissioned by the Department of Foreign Affairs as well. It was a souvenir project to make a souvenir of Ireland. So there's this. Well, yeah, something that you could buy in a gift shop in an airport. And I thought that there was this tradition of, there was a tradition of selling that dying American immigrants could, for a small fee, get a package of turf sent to their address in America, which they could burn and die to the smell of the homeland. So the turf thing is kind of really great and really portable and very light. And the other side of this is that there is a game in the Annals played by Fionn McCool and all these others called Unbrand of, which means the black needle or the raven. And it's a version of Tafel, which is the Scandinavian game, the Viking game. But the Viking game starts with 11 pieces. No, 11 squares, 11 by 11. And as it migrates down the coast of Europe, it gets smaller and smaller, as you would, it's portable culture. So by the time it gets to Ireland, it's 7 by 7, but there's no board left. We don't know what the board was like. There is a board found in the Isle of Man, which is a 7 by 7. So I thought, okay, we have the game but no board. Interesting souvenir. So this is on Brandov. Brandov, at the centre of Brandov, this is Crow, or Crew, the black crow, the raven. Corbusier, same thing. And all Celtic cultures have this figure. She's sort of nemesis. She flies over the battlefield and lands on the shoulder of those who are going to die. And it's an end game. It's played in the round. It's an invaders game. They say that it was used to train baby Vikings to how to invade countries. But basically, the queen, or the crew, is in the middle, and she's outnumbered. She's got 4 defenders, but there's 8 coming from the periphery. And basically, it's endgame chess, where you're outnumbered and you're playing for stalemate. And if she gets to the edge of the island, it's stalemate and she wins. So the figures are cut out of one extrusion of turf, and she is the conclusion of the pitched roofs and the butterfly roofs, and she's this funny figure that can stand up. You can see her there being annoyed in the middle, and then it comes as a tube with a rubber band in a triangular box with a big crow on it. This is Gregor Tamagotchi. This is a tiny project for a friend, Moncon McGann, who's taken upon himself to talk to the Irish people about the Irish language and the love of words, and what a great, that thing about, the penal laws. The first thing you do is you destroy language if you want to destroy culture. So he's really working back at all these old words. So it's a theatre set really that he can put in the back of his car and hang it in a venue, and then he goes inside of it into the middle, and he's standing there barefoot, and you go in, and he gives you a word on a card, an old Irish word, like a word for goosebump or puddle, or and he repeats it to you 3 times, and then you take it away and you have to use it. But we called it the wizard. And it's basically linen on a cross form, makes a little house that can hang in any venue. And it's cut, so it becomes increasingly immersive, let's say, as you go into the spiral. And there he is with so you get this funny thing of, naked feet and naked legs underneath this big gown, and then a queue of people into it, like hearing confession, and then they come out with their words and they start muttering them to one another. It's quite nice. And then this is Irish Aid. So this is Department of Foreign Affairs again, where they wanted to communicate and educate the citizens as to where their donations for overseas aid was being spent and how it was being spent. And there was some office space as well, and then there was two performance spaces, and then a lot of exhibition that was all projected. And so it was kind of a newsreel thing. And it was on the main street in Dublin, on O'Connell Street. So it was a shop fit out, basically, and it was a shop information. It was an open, vibrant community space. So it's a 60s building overhead, and it cracks around that, and is intelligent about how air comes in from the back and is sucked up into the thing, and then all of the exhibition is projected, and it basically becomes an essay in granite floor and plasterboard walls, and in these existing columns, there were 6 of them, and then projects onto the windows and so on, and really tries to engage with the street. And then this is the last bar. This is the landside bar in Terminal 2 in Dublin, which is a new terminal that was built in 2010, something like that. And we got the job to just make the bar. So again, there's this, landscape. It always comes down to landscape and OM and all of this business. But basically, it's a plywood, oak veneered assemblage of elements that had to travel up the lift and be assembled on the floor in, I think, 2 days. So it makes a bunch of snugs as vaults, and then it makes this kind of tree that makes a space under which you think you're really in Ireland. And then this is the Pálás. This is actually the signage as the section, which we did in neon ultimately. But it's the Pálás is the Pálás was made again as government funding out of EU funding about centres of a certain size, urban centres of a certain size, having art house cinemas. It took a long time to make. It's really about. I suppose it's the closest getting to perhaps some idea of hyper kind of ordinary or frugal glamour or a certain kind of deluxe. And it's really interested in how people move and go to the pictures and those kind of closures or openings between outside and inside, and dream space and reality and reflection and light, essentially, natural and projected. And then it tries to push it a little on having untempered spaces in everything but the rooms you see coloured there. So the red ones are the cinemas and they're black boxes. The yellow ones are bar and cafe. And the rest of it's effectively outside. So you get things like this. This is the window scheme. The windows are all done with Pat Scott and Eric Pearce. So that's an unfolded elevation, but it's also the wayfinding. And then the pictures adjust the town, and then we try to make everything we could, as little product as possible, and then it's kind of, I think now it's very interested in the applied arts basically and reclaiming them for architecture at the expense of product. And it's got a wriggly plan. That's a solar stack off the bar which illuminates the acoustic lobbies. These are all Dennis's pictures. So it's an old building to the front. It's kind of cropped, readjusted, cropped. It's not really. It's the ghost of an old building with the original teeth, and that's how it sits in the town. Kind of, it has a job to do as a urban gateway, stretching the old town to the docks. And then it tries to insinuate itself into the existing kind of, let's say, charming, well, certainly Merchants Road, that building there, and what goes off beside it. As a strategy, it sidesteps perhaps the issue of the corner and amplifies it. And then it becomes a figure in the town, and it's got a weather vane on it. And it's quite simple actually as an extrusion of the ground, the plot upwards and then a pyramid on top, and it ends up doing things like that. And that's the last slide.
Thank you for letting us in a little bit.
But it is all kind of the same, you know. Like, I mean, I came second for the pitch before last for the Venice Biennale, and I wanted to do an inflatable, and I wanted to do an inflatable bridge, you know. So I wish there was more ski wear or, you know, kind of more North Face kind of techno projects, but they're all sort of, you know, heavy. That's just the way do you know what I mean? Yeah.
So when does it start to be architecture then? Like, you made the distinction as to whether something is an installation, a sculpture, or a pavilion.
Well, they're just types, aren't they? I mean, really, they're all architecture, I think.
Inflatables.
Oh, inflatables, yeah, inflatables I think qualify, yeah, definitely. What do you mean?
Well, when you presented the pavilion and you were saying you almost introduced it like it was almost more of a sculpture when just seeing the axonometric, looking at it from the outside, and then actually, it is architecture because you can walk into it. It's a pavilion, actually. You almost corrected yourself.
Yeah, because, I mean, you're caught always between the sort of Duchamp's line and Losa's line about what is architecture, between plumbing and so on. So I just realised that the thing couldn't really be just a reek of turf, that it had to have some secret colour, a mystery or something to make it more. I think it was very powerful because you're in a body of material of that and the smell and so on. But it just felt like that you needed to be. It's a propaganda piece. It's a propaganda piece, and it's jokey, but it's not. It has all that. I mean, there was a lot of. It's funny that it's become, or it's funny that it still exists in a way. It's funny, like Andrew cites it in his, because at the time it was, very easy to mock, Bogman and so on. But the actual shape of those things, those briquettes, are just, it's a German system. They're really beautiful, and the strapping used to be orange. Now it's green, which is a disaster visually. But soon they're not going to be around anymore. Like, we kind of knew that. The projection was that they would be around for 25 more years, so they're coming to an end. But really, it was about the material. When we brought it to Japan, we brought some of the material to Japan, and all Japanese were like going, wild for it. It's really, really powerful. It's shiny on the outside and it's cleaved on the other edges, and just putting it together was a pleasure. So, I mean, that. But then the form of it had to, play the gymnastics of being dedicated to N. I mean, Piranesi does an N. So it just seemed like it would be fun to try and do Nicholas of NM. You've no brief for these things, You have no brief really for these kinds of projects unless it's data or sociology or something. So you're trying to you're plunging the problem as hard as you can to generate content sufficient to actually drive the material into a shape. Does that make sense? Nicholas of Myra, Santa Claus, was the lodestar by which decisions were made. But it's just funny. And it's really funny to tell to tell his story and to tell all the stories about his apocryphal life, and it felt kind of good to do a shaggy dog story for an Irish pavilion. But I don't want to be the storyteller guy. I mean, it kind of diminishes, I think, the work. So it's sort of a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Do you say that because do you think that's how your work is perceived?
Yeah, and it's my own fault, I think, because you're talking to people and you're talking to journalists, and you're just talking about the stuff, and you end up talking in a certain kind of a way, I suppose, and then that becomes a story, and then that becomes a criticism or a tyranny, and it is really in a way, but it's said with the full understanding that the thing has to absolutely rock by itself.
But presenting a project is inevitably telling a little bit of a story, isn't it? Even presenting it tonight and even deciding to make the images really small on the screen.
That's the way it turned out. I'm sorry.
a big...
just do, yeah, they just do, but I mean, I suppose, like, when you look at it like that, you can that's a pretty continuous inquiry about material and figuration, you could say, with, John Hind is there, in that they are all images that are constructed to represent a reality that doesn't really exist, or so they're kind of but actually by kind of doing that, like all the previous, like Robin Walker and all of these people, by doing that you can actually construct a new image somehow, I think. But it just seems I just think it's kind of it's a funny thing to have an issue about a country or an issue about a place like that is kind of funny. It's kind of difficult. It has two sides to it. One is of, and one is kind of against. I don't see myself as living on a periphery. I'm not sure I even see myself, like, I was born in London.
You say that because of what Andrew wrote of Ireland being at the periphery?
Yeah, and I'm not sure that with all due respect, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think you have to be in the centre. Everybody's in the centre. You kind of have to operate within that. And this kind of idea of, pollination by crosswinds is sort of not true, really.
So you feel, because you feel, feeling at the centre, yes, but I guess the influences and where things come from and how they're translated and brought to a place.
But it presumes that the influence has a source.
Yeah.
And often it doesn't.
Or it gets moved around.
Yeah, a lot.
Transformed as it moves.
Yeah, so it's more like a zeitgeist or a fashion, dare I say it, or like we went through layers, as you have here and as you are now. We're going through different fields of interest, and they tend to move between classical generally and romantic, and they just tick-tack back and forth over a generation, as we know. And we're in a certain one now again, and it reflects a certain kind of situation. But I'm not sure, I'm not sure that it's right to not presume that every receiver of that information is not at their own centre. That it's somehow second-hand feels kind of shoddy, and and then you get William Chambers. William Chambers makes a model makes the model for Lord Charlemont, and then it's this genius builder who takes the Pearwood model and builds it, and all the compromises come from that, and that's what we're all in love with. But the carpenter isn't interested in Palladio.
But it's a series of translations, isn't it? That originate in a particular moment in time, at least, and usually a place. Yeah, but if you look at it a slightly different way, it's not the fusion line at all. It's actually something else. It's actually, like we were laughing about tonsures earlier, Tom. There is an Irish tonsure as opposed to the classic tonsure. And the Irish tonsure is front up, fully receding here, because all the monks had red hair, and you recede this way when you've got red hair. And they asked for dispensation from the Pope to qualify. And how do you think Irish architecture is perceived from abroad then? I know you're challenging the idea of even doing like an issue around a country or a territory.
I think it's amazing the way our Irish architecture is perceived. I think it's absolutely incredible, and and there's a lot of kind of on the islands, a lot of Team Ireland and all of that. But it seems to me that it's not a national effort, and it's not a ground located project, and there's something else going on that's about teaching. Actually, I think it's about teachers. I think it's about where the teachers were. And it's about a kind of authority, and it's about a clarity of intention and a clarity generally of technology as well, and a certain kind of politics
that make Irish architecture.
Yeah, I think that makes any kind of, if you can place some kind of collective around work, but it's actually, I know with respect, you have to, it's neat to say that this is Irish architecture, but actually, like, that stuff is kind of moving around.
I think what's quite interesting for us is that even though, and we never obviously would, claim to solve or the questions around Irish architecture today, or to say that that's that's what it is and that's where it's at now, and to kind of freeze it in time. It's more, I guess it's more a filter through which to try and understand and start to create almost like dialogues between some of the projects, some of the ideas, some of the people within a single publication, which I guess is what this idea of a bound book sort of gives you. There's an order, there's a structure, there's a rhythm to these things, and you have like a concentration of ideas that there is like some sort of a common ground. There's some sort of, even if it's arguably arbitrary in the sense that it's derived from man-made borders that make us understand the world the way we do, and I guess it's trying to make sense of something.
I think that the Burr School is interesting in the magazine because it kind of represents a tradition that was cut off. At a very precise point, probably when Group 91, as we know them, came into their own as teachers and young architects. I mean, Peter and Mary Doyle were teaching in UCD when I was there, so was Shane, and it's interesting to look at the before and after pictures when you see the gutters. I mean, for such technical people to have, and then when you see what's there today, and the whole roof technology and so on. So there's a kind of an interesting shift, I think, technically, from the, let's call it the Messian tradition that was kind of, there's a moment where it was dropped for kind of a very, very low-tech approach. I think that what Gary and John McLaughlin have been doing about that building and its position in a kind of a much broader context with the Smithsons and so on of a certain time is terrifically interesting, but it didn't have really any purchase, except if you look at, say, Scott Talon Walker and, Scott Talon Walker, they continued with that line of inquiry and kind of beat it to death. But I thought it was good that I thought it was really good that you published that in the magazine.
Thank you. I'm glad we're talking about some of the other pieces, and I guess for us it's important with what Shelley McNamara said. Actually, it's like, there are architects who are old and some who are young. There's some who are alive. There's some who are dead, and that's kind of what makes it interesting. And I guess if a project is carrier of an idea that is like relevant and has importance today, then we feel it's important to publish it and to include it. It sort of brings it to a present day conversation. And I'm glad you're speaking about some of the other pieces in the magazine, but I kind of wanted to go back to your work. And I wanted, and I guess in that instance to Pálás, but which I'm probably saying wrong. Do you think it's possible to understand the building without having been to it?
I think it's got nice plans. They're pretty tight plans, and the section is nice, and the elevation. I think you can get it on one level, but as a scheme, as a kind of a scheme. But no, it's better to go. It's better to go. Definitely better to go, and it's a very anxious building to please you. And sometimes it goes a little too far, perhaps.
That's all intentional. That's all intentional.
Yeah, totally. It's absolutely about being as urgent as possible or as alert as possible to to manipulate you as heavily as it possibly can at all times, which is probably not correct, but it does try to do that.
Do you think? Does the program of the building, the fact that it's a picture house, a cinema, has an importance, or that could have been said of any building? Like, is the actual program and the fact that you're walking into you're leaving the sort of like the city and the street, you're walking into a place and you have this sort of like transition, I guess. You have a lot of stairs, but then your destination is to go into a room, a black box where you're going to be watching a film and you're going to be somewhere else entirely. So to what extent is the idea of almost discomfort that you're imposing on visitors, like to negotiate that transition
between... discomfort? It's such a rude thing to say.
I feel
Why is it discomfort? I can't. You mean that it's, what is it you say, it's wild?
That it's difficult to navigate.
Yeah.
That it leaves you a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there was a point. I mean, there's a shift in the section, where it could have been just the stairs and the stairs on either end and a stack of rooms. Great. But to kind of do a Tommy Cooper move on the back stairs generates that situation. And I thought about it really long and hard and realized that I could do that. Did I want to do that? Is that the right thing to do? And and I suppose at the time I was kind of in a mantra of, this is not a modern building. This is, and this is not a. And I was interested in Galway's idea of itself as a medieval town. If you go there, it has some, but it's not Bruges or something. Like it doesn't have. So but I was interested in the little piece that they had and how we could intensify that. And it did seem to me that in a town of, 80,000 people, that you could actually probably go to the pictures with a friend that knows it, or that you could ask somebody for directions, and that would all be very, very, very positive. And so I thought that it was worth the...
I like that
obfuscation of it, yeah. It's not, it could have been a lot clearer, but if it was a lot clearer, the bar would have been smaller. And I thought that, in other words, by pushing the people around the back of the bar and getting that whole backstairs thing going on, that actually made the bar a proper suite of rooms that would really and genuinely probably support an art house cinema. So it was about kind of gaining a bit of space there, but really it was the challenge of trying to get people through and around this. I've always loved going to, say, theatres like the Olympia in Dublin, or there are many of them, old ones, that you go in the front door and you go through the processional thing, and then you come out the fire escape and you land out into the town in a completely different way in the back of house and all of that. And I've always loved all of that business. And then if you compound that with going into the dark and in this case, you're not heated, so then you come in and it's warm, and then it gets dark, and then you watch the film, and then you come back out again, and then all the windows are messing around with the light levels and the colour of the space. I thought that it would be, I suppose, intoxicating and forgiven for that indulgence of asking you to. I mean, there aren't enough toilets in the building, that's for sure. But
Please doesn't mention that.
yeah, there aren't enough toilets in the building, that's for sure. But I think that it's okay. I mean, because it's kind of funny that we want to, people say, oh, why should I buy my ticket outside? And you go, but we have corner shops, we have kiosks, we have all of that business. Like, our navigation of the city is always about thresholds between inside and outside, whether it's air curtains or whatever way you want to look at it. So the expectation that the institution has a door and you walk into it, and after that it's fine, you can take your jacket off and everything's just going to be clear. I mean, it's not a big ask to remove that.
I'm not saying it is, and I'm not saying discomfort is a bad thing either.
No.
I just like the contrast between the way you talk about Pálás's relationship to Galway, and I guess with some of the pictures, one of the things we wanted Dennis to do was to like contextualize the building, because I feel like we had a lot of shots where it was kind of very tightly cropped, and we were struggling to sort of understand it and to understand how it sits. Where it sits, and when you were going through it, as you were like moving further and further away from the building in your presentation, you were almost talking about it like a character in town, and like which face it was showing, depending on which side you were like approaching it from, and then at the same time, once you get closer to it and you go in, it's an entirely different world.
I was worried about it being concrete. I thought there was going to be war about it being concrete. But nobody has mentioned concrete. I mean, the audience or the town, for a town that really likes stone, that was kind of what I thought was going to be the problem, that the materiality of it. But it is interesting that some people, like I remember Bob Quinn, the film director, coming up to me and saying, "I'm lost. Thank you," at the opening. But other people don't want to be lost, and that's. But if you go to, say, something like T Nocturne or any of those great old town, old bars, old theatres, they have a kind of a quality of that where the house is bigger than its occupants, that there's more going on. And I think I was interested in it being a house, really, without being grandiose, but that it was kind of shambolic, kind of that everything insinuates itself upon itself, and so it has consequences that are quite rational, actually, whether they're the extrusion of code, or it's that order of tempered room versus untempered, or it's square box against medieval or Georgian footprint, and that the clanging of all of these kind of pressure points that could actually be the kind of cityscape of the interior.
You're saying that the problem was like no one complained about the fact that it was concrete.
No, I thought that would be, because it was in the planning. It's meant to be white. In the planning permission, it's painted white. But we ran out of money. But I mean, technically, to make that thing in concrete, like it's a 9-story monolith. There's no DPCs. It's all cantilevered. It's in 3 dimensions. It's tricky. It's a remarkable feat, I think, from the engineers and from the builders. Basically, everything is on transfer beams and is transferring itself across its stairs, up and so on. It's very interesting on that level, and I think you feel that when you're in it. I think you can feel the gearings of the space, particularly when you walk around the outside of it. And I suppose the attempt to resolve that in 3 dimensions was. As well as, obviously, the interest in the Tower House type and the feeling that trying to elicit that feeling of where you can get concrete on the outside and concrete on the inside. That you can be in rooms that have condensation in them and so on, that you're traveling through them, and then you can get to the perfect plush seat and a cone of light, and the thing happens, and it's red, cartoon red dresses on each of the rooms. But to kind of push that procedure as far as it could possibly go was I think the concern ultimately, to try and resolve all of the bits because there's only two. It's just one street, which is Merchants Road and Dock Road. So there's two. It only plays two geometries. It's very single-minded, really, in its plan, and then its section just exploits whatever is left over.
You didn't show the plans, did you? I know I showed them at the beginning.
I didn't show them, no.
I'm just interested about how we communicate a building, I guess. I mean, it's a lot of the work that we have to do in terms of, explaining a project, but also communicating maybe like a journey through it or its atmosphere, and how, and I guess it's the word story for lack of a better word, but kind of what story do we tell it through? And I feel like even the choice of slides, starting with a section that is almost like has like a diagrammatic feel, about you to kind of like understand it. I feel like we certainly do, like as editors, but I think as architects we do as well, have a little bit of control as to how we present something, whether it's a board game, a pavilion, a cinema, and I guess I'm just trying to, because we were trying to make sense of it as we were working on the layout of it, trying to understand what information do the pictures tell us, what do the sketches tell us, or other models, how do we explode it a little bit to kind of reveal that three-dimensional complexity and to make it understandable. And we were asking ourselves to what extent, I guess, it needed to be fully understood, or whether it needed to remain a bit mysterious and because it can't quite be communicated perhaps on paper.
Well, in fairness to the article, Lily, the lady who commissioned it originally, Lelia Doolan, who is an amazing person, filmmaker and many other things, she saw it. I sent it to her, and she said she's got it. So I think probably, it would be nice to get to that point where you can't really, the pictures are just indicative, but that maybe writing can get closer to an experience. I think that's about right. I think that's really maybe the condition we want to get to, isn't it? Where you kind of had to be there. So I thought it was good. I mean, those sketches, those haven't been published, and I don't really like architecture sketches somehow, but it's... because they have the whiff of that you knew what you were doing at the beginning. Do you know what I mean? And they're never really good drawings.
I really like
really
these.
Good drawings.
We were glad we finally received them.
But they were done for the client. They were done for the client to actually.
Right. And I think the intention behind this, the worst sketch is the fake napkin sketch, isn't it? The one you do afterwards, as to that was the idea. No. But as a way of working through a building in architectural form, a three-dimensional complexity, they're a tool.
Oh yeah, they're that building was done more or less like with cardboard models and little
yeah, we never saw
like
those.
No, they all go away. They all get broken. But rough models and
no rhino or anything like that. A little bit, maybe, a little bit, teeny weeny bit. But most of it was just done, it's very, it was very defined, really, the shell. So we had and it was defined the extent of a room. You had to maximize the number of seats. And then the rest of it is just coordinated basically on almost domestic turning circles for stairs and so on. So it's quite, so we could actually take each piece of the complex pieces and just model them at 1 to 20 big and go, yeah, that'll work, and then draw it and move off like that. But when the contractor he had the job, at a certain point he threatened to sue because the contract documents did not describe the building, he said. Because you can't really represent the under of the over even in a section. You just can't do it, particularly if it's happening in lots of different ways. So I kind of love that, and we drew lots and lots and lots of sections through that building. But actually, the builders built it off one. Like we did, it was like a CAT scan of sections to try and make it all work. But it was all built off one section. 6 brilliant joiners who just worked it out in 3 dimensions and did it. It's kind of amazing like that when you kind of realize the power of those old-fashioned drawings. They're really strong, and they're the drawings that often crew like to work with because it's all there, and they're the drawings that you see crumpled around the building site. It's just kind of, when they're not useful anymore. But those little sketches were for. I mean, Solace was a group of cineasts, basically the old Galway Film Society, the Galway Film Fleadh, and various people who were just interested in movies. So it was very easy to talk to them about the romance of cinema. And I remember one of them gave me a book on Deco cinemas, English Deco cinemas, the history of the Deco cinema, and Lelia suggested that it would be called the Picture Palace. It was changed to Pálás afterwards because the ownership changed. But when the minute it was called the Picture Palace, which was out of the Claddagh Palace, which was out of an earlier cinema, that kind of set the tone. It's going to have to be a little bit deluxe. And then it was a question of how do you kind of put lipstick on the kind of gorilla of the object. So hence the kind of, there's a license for neon on concrete, and there's license for coloured windows, and there's, you start to get quite thrilled at how naughty you might be about using fabric. And there's nothing behind but tissue paper. You go, ooh, yeah, great. That kind of sort of feather boa kind of detailing. I really enjoyed all of that. And that's kind of part of that old, before they became electric temples, when they're, that transition in the 20s, I suppose, from being music hall to being cinemas, and there's little stages and so on, that kind of world was something that the client was after, actually, at the beginning, and so supported all of the decisions about tempering and not tempering, and the tea room as a hall of mirrors, and the bar as a traditional, all of those kind of narrative, let's face it, narrative discussions were kind of driven out of an idea from Solace about Galway and the west of Ireland, and making a new building in a small town that had elbows, and maybe put it up to the town a little bit about what it thinks of itself, which I suppose is the kind of closed loop on maybe any of those kind of projects where you're dealing with, like, it has Pálás on one side and Pálás on the other, and that's, people in Dublin are saying Pálás is just a Gaelicization of Pálás, and you're kind of going, you know, so it's a big row erupts about Palazzo and Pala and so on, and you know, the diacritics and how they're used in the windows and so on. So it's kind of like just, but they're real, like Galway's a centre for Celtic studies and languages, so it's kind of getting in underneath these kind of silly discussions, really. But it's the same word either side, but the Irish one faces out to the town, and the English one faces in, and then the air con comes in through Pálás and the gable. I got a lot of pleasure out of fooling around like that with it. And I think that pulling signage and wayfinding and identity, and you know, like when you think of, you know, Bonjour Tristesse, that's only because Caesar doesn't like graffiti, and he decided that if they paint it out, it'll leave a stain on the building, so leave it. And you kind of think that's really compelling, because that's the first image that you know that you hit. And but then it becomes a difficulty where actually you want all of the signage, like the running man becomes, oh, let's arrange the running men so that they're running down the stairs. And the electrician goes, no. And then what happens is more signage comes in after you go, and then you feel that the signage isn't signage enough. It isn't signagey. It isn't signing enough. It isn't on the architecture. So it becomes a kind of tyranny in itself, where you try and manage all of the, where you try and, I suppose it's like where you try and incorporate the letters into the space.
I like that you, I mean, I don't really like the word narrative as a word itself, but that you needed to use it. You couldn't.
Yeah. Well, it just,
do it without it.
I don't, but I think that people do it all the time, don't they? I mean, don't we all do that? Like, don't we have to kind of talk it into existence? I mean,
of course.
And you have to share it with your colleagues or makers, or I mean, and you have to, I suppose, manage how it's described. But I think that that's kind of fundamental. Like, it's like, isn't it, you know, you just kind of go, isn't it, what is it like? It's like one of those, isn't it? And the kind of process of designing something is kind of trying to find out what it is. So it's a kind of a game of charades or something, isn't it, until it settles. And then by the time you've gone through all of those images, ideally it kind of has synthesized into something else.
Yeah, it settles, and then I guess there's what happens after those. I find it quite interesting that as time passes, the amount of images and drawings that are used to almost represent at that point, to describe a project, reduce, you know, and then
that's really
a week, a month, a year, 10 years down the line, you have two pictures, and that's you know, you name a project and everyone has the same image in their mind, and it's been reduced, and it changes the story or the perception or the idea of the building over time.
Yeah, that's true. That's your field now, isn't it?
But I guess it's the same when presenting, you know, when lecturing about a body of work. The images that we keep about particular projects, and the ones we bring in as part of the conversation, and the ones that get kind of edited out by the architects, by editors, by everything, by the world of the internet, you know.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Well, it's really fun to see. I mean, the whole world of internet and Instagram, and particularly with public projects, when you can see other people taking pictures, and you can see the pictures that they're taking, and you're going, yeah, that's a really good picture. Oh, or I saw that one coming, but I didn't see that one. That's a really good one, you know. And it's a real joy to see them. Like when that place opened, because it was a kind of an event, you know. So I was away, but you could see it kind of fluttering out over Instagram and so on. And it was really moving and kind of sweet. And you do realize that, you know, we have a great deal in common, how we experience things and what we see. And that's kind of reassuring, I think.
I quite like it when photographed, and this is why we sometimes like to, and when we can, we commission photography almost to show the building in a different light, even to the architect. Sometimes, you know, you see things that you might not have seen. I'm conscious that we're talking, and I was wondering if there are any questions in the audience. It's quite dark, so I can't properly see, but I wanted to give everyone a chance to comment or to question. Lily?
I have...
Oh, sorry, there's a mic coming. There's one at the back as well.
I just wondered in the context of talking about, I mean, this is a while ago now, but Irishness and kind of differences of opinion on what that might mean. I wondered what you kind of reckon about being, to use your words, a kind of propaganda project, is maybe what you said. And what doing that as a sole individual or as a small group of people, what do you reckon about that role?
You mean constructing identity?
Yeah.
Yeah, tricky. But we do it all the time. I thought with the pavilion in Venice, actually the offer was that the Venezuela pavilion wasn't being used this year. Would you like to show some drawings? And I thought, no, let's try and make something, to be on the ground, to make something. And I knew pretty quickly that it should be in briquettes because I could get them for free and we could arrange somebody to transport them. So then after that, once you kind of... But then after that, it was about twisting it, that it wasn't the field or one of those stories, that it was actually... I mean, the thing about the briquettes is, I don't think people had really... Briquettes were kind of crap. They were like £2.20 and you bought them in your supermarket and you went home and you lit them and they burned, and they weren't really good fuel. They were bad fuel compressed to be slightly better fuel, but they weren't as good as coal, which is English. So yes, you're kind of in that territory of the HARP, the Department of Foreign Affairs. It's a bit of a you're representing the country. You're supposed to be. But on the other hand, in 2000, Venice Biennale I don't know how many people saw that thing. Very few, I think, actually. It was in a very remote area, and Irish architecture, capital I, capital A, wasn't really what it is today. And today you have to compete for that role of being the author of the pavilion or the authors of the pavilion. Then it was, I just was asked, would you like to do it? Because I was young and probably had loads of energy. So in a funny kind of way, it was just a lot of fun to fool around with those things and to try and talk. Kind of talk about them, actually. Like everybody goes, oh yeah, and all of this stuff comes out, which is kind of with a maybe fiddle music kind of soundtrack in the background. But the actual thing itself, then, by having a kind of a classical order and referring back to corbel construction, and I was obsessed that there should be no lintels. That was my thing at the time. No lintels. All lintels or no lintels, because the lintel is classical, and we're not doing lintels. And so it was kind of about going back to Italy without lintels. That was actually the driver. Does that make any sense? Not really. No. You're talking about a darker thing. You're talking about You're
the
talking about the
propaganda
truth.
project.
You're talking about constructing
Identity, yeah.
identity.
I think it's interesting that in the way that Andrew talked about it, and in the way that it's perhaps perceived now, it feels like an object with a huge amount of resonance. And to hear you talk about it, you do something to strip
Andrew
away that
worked in the
poetry.
office when it was being done. Andrew selected those postcards with me. He wouldn't say that in his article. Yeah, it was. It's become somehow it communicated, and it's
And
good for that.
resonated, yeah.
It's good for that.
I think there was another question at the back.
Yeah, hi Tom. I'm a little bit confused, to be honest. I remember back in probably 2002, 2003 when you came for a crit upstairs, and we were all very excited as students, we had a good time. And having seen the project and kind of your explanation now about cinema, it kind of, it feels, I'm not sure what exactly we're looking at. It feels that the times have moved on. Obviously, we now have so many more kind of pressing issues to wrestle with. It's not just about, economy and war, but it's actually climate and actually how we do things and what we do them with and everything else that comes with it. And kind of looking at the cinema, to me, I appreciate all your knowledge and kind of and theoretical background, but looking at it feels almost as a kind of a archaeology, or it's a kind of a reconstruction of early kind of Soviet architecture, with a very significant twist. But does it address well enough the environment that actually, and the main issues that actually we need to address? And same is with, same actually, in a way, criticism is I'm aiming at AR. It's what message do we put across with this highly intelligent work, but also almost highly irrelevant? Where does the tangible point between the challenge and the work, where is it?
I think that's a good question. I think the issue of climate or environment or whatever, I think that it's, if I'm to defend, let's say, I think it's about comfort, actually. I think that we really need to look at the culture of comfort and how it has leapfrogged and changed and adjusted in our lifetimes, in our parents' lifetime. It just keeps going. And I think that kind of extends into construction then, and how you deal with questions of temperance. If you're referring to a large concrete building, sure, that can be discussed. But I think that all of the works there don't have a bias on. I think that the Pálás is very engaged in environment. Actually, I think it's very engaged and maybe is criticised. Or can be criticised in terms of how far it pushes the user in terms of questions of enclosure. In terms of questions of construction, I don't think we really need. Fundamentally, I don't think Galway really needs a new cinema. So if we start from that position, I find it hard to defend. Does that help, or do you want to go further?
Do you want to go further? It's it obviously doesn't. You can't. it's obvious that is missing the main aspect. I understand your explanation about comfort and that I haven't been, and I'm sure that the best way to experience the building is obviously to visit the building, so I can't talk from that point of view. I can just talk through what's being communicated in a way to me and for the little kind of additional that I know about the project. But I mean, we are not talking, the building is not being built around the experience of like exposure, cold weather and comfortable, then you go and, there may be tangible elements, but the majority it's a large concrete chair with big steel beams and et cetera, so it doesn't address at all the issue of actually embodied carbon and basically, any of those, even without talking about sustainability, because sustainability doesn't do it anymore. We can't, the time is gone where we had to be sustainable. Now it's kind of, we moved to another phase of actually how far we need to actually reach. So, do you have any interest in that? I don't think it's about really comfort. I actually disagree with you. I think that, sure, people now kind of want to be able to control more climate, et cetera, internally, and more heat, et cetera, or more cooling. But we're not talking in terms of, obviously, global climate kind of change, climate change. We're not talking about. It's not the main issue is not within comfort. The main issue is not within people want more air cons. It's part of the problem, but it's not it. It's architects are so in a way behind. In my opinion, are so behind. And also, to be honest, AA is behind as well in kind of being more radical in terms of actually. What we do about it. Because we know that it's an issue. We know that we can't go on like this. But it's kind of, we prefer the comfort of going to something highly intelligent and getting lost in it, which it's a valid point, but actually it doesn't really do much more than that.
I'm wondering if this is a question which we should answer by going upstairs, having a drink, and I think it's a very broad question. I feel like if we're trying to, it's going to be very difficult to wrap up on that. I think in terms of the AR, I think one of the, there is a lot of a lot of our content does sort of look at and address and, completely takes the climate crisis into account. I feel like in some of the themes that we've done this year, whether it's about money or about oceans, or we're challenging a lot of things. I don't think we should only publish content that enables us to have these conversations. I think we also, a lot of the role of a publication is to also look at the kind of significant buildings that are going up and trying to understand them, to unpick them, and there needs to be a little bit of diversity in the content that we publish in the buildings that we select, and they enable us to touch on lots of different topics. I don't know to what extent the extended sort of timeline of Pálás means that it, some of the things might have been done differently if it had been done at a different time, but I don't know. It's a very broad question, I guess, in terms of what we prioritize in the conversation, what we put at the forefront of conversations. But I think there's multiple reasons as to why we build particular projects or publish particular buildings. I think we have to keep a kind of multiplicity of ideas and of debates.
It's hard to see how we will really engage with what you're talking about. It's hard to see how fully, we can build right down through the industry and through all the consultancies. It's really hard to imagine how we can build, big buildings in cities with the very full knowledge of their impacts right now. I think we do have to change what we expect from buildings. I think that will change.
It is changing.
Yeah, and personally, I still, notwithstanding your comments, I still find that the most interesting aspect of the subject at the moment. This question of how can we make space that's alert to, or more alert, or more outside, or less tempered, or more in between, than so that we feel differently in it. Now, maybe that's not right. Maybe that's not enough. But I find that the most dynamic and interesting aspect of the subject at the moment, and growing. I think I have to agree with you in terms of you saying that there is no environmental agenda on that project in terms of its construction. Is that in a nutshell what you're saying? I don't know where the jury really sits. I mean, maybe it's a little early to say, but it wasn't very high. It wasn't very high in our concerns, to be honest with you. 10 years ago when we were proposing it. Maybe it would be different now, maybe it would not. I mean, I love working with concrete. I mean, is that going to go away? Hardly. How it's managed, that's going to get very interesting. I think the salient question is, can it be a good? Is that a fundamental flaw that you offer?
In what? In use of concrete?
That it's not.
Well, we know that
On current term, I know. No, without going into, but on it can. It does become very. It does become very. Complex to ascertain the ecological, the value or the non-value of a piece of work like that in a circumstance like that. It's not. The calculations are very difficult to make. No.
they're not that difficult to make.
No, I mean, if you expand it to available technologies, if you expand it to available know-hows, if you expand it to local needs and so on, does it not become more complex?
It doesn't.
No?
I feel like we should continue this debate with drinks and canapes. I think it's upstairs in the front members' room, is that right? But thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to the AA for having us, and thanks, Tom, for flying.